This is Dr. Konda Nageshwar, Director, OUCIP. I welcome you all for online lecture series 5 as part of the OUCIP online lecture series. This is the 5th lecture. Today, our topic is post-war Jewish American novel, Some Observations. As we know, the Jewish novel enjoys a unique place in the post-war American literature. And the Jewish novelist galvanized the fictional world by treating the Jewish destiny as universal condition and the Jew as a man of the 20th century. To talk on this topic, the OUCIP has invited an eminent scholar, Professor Sukhbir Singh. Professor Sukhbir Singh, sir, is an eminent scholar in comparative literature and yoga philosophies. In fact, he retired from Usman University as a professor emeritus after serving for more than 3 decades. Professor Sukhbir Singh, sir, has specialized and taught comparative literature and yoga philosophy over a long period. He is actually one of the most accomplished professors in his field today in the country. He was awarded the Senior Fulbright Visiting Fellowship at the prestigious Divinity School of the University of Chicago. He has attended a number of seminars, conferences, and presented a number of papers, and he has given lectures widely in India and abroad, like US, Ireland, Thailand, Nepal, and published books and about 100 research papers in Asia, Europe, and American journals. Right now, he's working at Nalanda University as the dean. He is one of the eminent scholars in the country in his field. Now, I invite Professor Sukhbir Singh, sir, to talk on the post-war Jewish American.
So, Dr. Nageshwara, thank you very much for a very lucrative introduction and for giving me this very wonderful opportunity to talk to all those who have registered for this lecture, and to some of my former students, and to all those who have come to listen to the Jewish novel and have interest in Jewish novel. Well, it is very difficult to resist the temptation of talking about ASRC, because I was for decades an inseparable part of ASRC setup and one of the permanent fixtures there. Whatever academic achievements I have gathered over the years, over the decades, American Center or OUCIP has played a significant role, because this library is one of the best outside of America on American studies, American literature, and so on. We never felt deficient of critical material. Whatever books we wanted, it was there. And sometimes we didn't expect the book to be there, but the book was there, to our great, great surprise. Some of the books that I did not find in the University of Chicago library, I found them at ASRC. And it was a matter of great surprise and great joy that we have on our campus such a fabulous library, such a rich library, that we don't have to look to any other library, any other university for material on American studies. So I also express my gratitude to ASRC for its contribution in making my career and in bringing me a number of laurels. It's nice to know that very active young man like Dr. Konda Nageshwar Rao has taken over its director, and I see some hope. It's hope of its revival of the good old days when it used to brim with the scholars and scholarship from all over the world. Those good old days might come again with Dr. Nageshwar Rao's sincere and dedicated efforts, and I'm sure he would leave no stone unturned in accomplishing it. Well, the topic today is an old hat Jewish American novel in the post-war period. Well, let me start with the starting. Jewish American novel has played a very crucial role in providing American literature a distinct identity. Before the coming of Jewish American novel in America, nobody took American literature seriously. And I can cite one personal instance. When I went to University of Chicago as a senior Fulbright fellow, I was invited to the inaugural dinner of the school, and that is Divinity School, one of the best in the country, in the world, sorry. And there, some European professors, it was full, it was at the Dean's house, and the room, the hall was full, because that was the inaugural dinner for the entire school. Only faculty was invited, and no students were present there. So they asked me, "What are you working on?" So I said, "I'm working on American literature." And one of them said, "American literature?" And they all laughed loudly. So that was the reputation American literature had among the European professors or in European academia. It was a laughing matter. It was a kind of joke. So it was a thing of fun and joy for European professors and European academia, because they didn't acknowledge that there was anything like American literature or American fiction or whatever. But after the coming of Jewish novel, Jewish poetry and Jewish drama, American literature acquired an identity everywhere, in America, in Asia, and in Europe. And American literature was introduced, was inducted in the syllabi in all the universities at the graduate as well as at the postgraduate levels. Now, how it started? It all started in the end of the 19th century. Well, the second half of the 19th century was full of turmoil in Europe, intellectual turmoil as well as cultural turmoil. And that turmoil sort of created an intellectual emaciation, in the sense that the European intelligentsia was busy in exploring the deeper recesses of the human self. The Industrial Revolution brought in commercialism and consumerism, both. And you know, the First World War was the commercial war. It was not a war for territories unlike the Second World War. It was a war for trade interests. So commercialization and then industrialization and consumerism, it all led to a neglection of the human self and a projection of the human mind, in the sense that Europe took a turn to intellectuality, and the human self, the heroic human self that the romantics had portrayed. And you know, Byronic heroes were known for their adventurism, for their romance, for their robust self, and so on and so forth. So it was something antithetical. Cultural effervescence, sophistication, then you have refinement, and then manners and morals and all kinds of constraints on human consciousness, on human psyche. So kind of, you know, what happened, intellect grew and the self weakened. The human self, the heroic human self, which Europe had inherited from the romantics, British romantics, European romantics and all, that got vanished. It took a back seat. And you can see it, you can find it in the novels of Guy de Maupassant, Alexander Dumas, and many others, Victor Hugo, and so on. You can ascertain it from their novels. Now this thing, you know, later on, this was symbolized by Yeats in his very famous poem, very prophetic poem, The Second Coming. And in The Second Coming, you know, there is a sphinx. And that sphinx has, it has a man's head and a lion's body. Man's head and lion's body, which means an intellectual beast that the European man had grown into. Intellectual beast. So when mind grew, the heart withered. And it is, you know, it is rampant in the modernist British novel or modernist European novel between the two wars, that is First World War and the Second World War. And who were the British novelists of that period and European novelists? You have in Britain, you had James Joyce, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence, and so many others of their ilk, of their kind. Then you had André Gide, you had Thomas Mann, you had Kafka, and you had Camus, and so many of them in the modernist group. They all, you know, portrayed the human self as weak and emaciated, as disillusioned and defeated. I mean, the self declined and intellect grew. Moreover, their literature was, their novel was pathological, in the sense that most of them suffered from some disease or the other. And they transmuted their diseases in their respective protagonists in some of their very famous novels, in some of their eminent novels. James Joyce suffered from myopia. Virginia Woolf suffered from mental derangement. D.H. Lawrence suffered from impotency. Later on, he died of TB also. And many others, they had many other diseases, and they were all preoccupied in sublimating their diseased self into a functional self, a healthy self in their protagonists. So it was the novel was pathological, not only in Britain, in Europe also, in all the European novels. You take Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. You know, an intellectual type of person, he falls in love with a young boy, and ultimately the young boy becomes a reason for his death. And in Magic Mountain, Hans Castorp is a patient in a TB sanatorium. Kafka suffered from morbidity, depression, chronic morbidity and depression. Andrezid from homosexuality. All of them had some prominent, prestigious disease or the other, and they all projected their disease. They all, sublimated their disease self in their novels, in their art. Now, whatever happened during those days, after the Second World War, or even otherwise, whatever happened in Europe happened in America also. America was piggybacking Europe. And European literature had a tremendous, a deeper influence on American artistic psyche. Now, who were the novelists in America during that period? And I would enumerate upon them very briefly. That is, you had Hemingway, Fitzgerald, E. Cummings, Sherwood Anderson, Gertrude Stein, Nathaniel West, and so on and so forth. These novelists also, like their European brothers, suffered from some physical or intellectual deformity. And they too were working out their mental and physical problems into their literary works. Hemingway's protagonists in the early novels, excepting The Old Man and the Sea, which was one of his last novels, I think, they are all, fractured characters. They are all deformed characters, disillusioned. For instance, you take one of his stories. The title of the story is A Clean and Well-Lighted Place. Clean and well-lighted place. There, one person, he comes to a restaurant, he comes to a bar, sits down there, and he keeps boozing the whole night. He keeps guzzling beer. And it's a routine matter for him. He comes every day, sits there in the light, and he keeps taking beer. One person asked him one day, why you come here every day, you keep sitting the whole night, you keep drinking beer? What is this business of drinking beer and all that? He said, he gave only one answer. It's a clean and well-lighted place. See the metaphor, clean and well-lighted place. This means the world is full of dirt, the world is full of darkness. And this dirt and darkness is cultural, it is moral, it is ethical, and it is spiritual. So, that kind of a thing. Now you take Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. Great Gatsby is trying to set the clock back. And in the end, I won't go into the story because it would take a long time. And in the end, he is found dead in mysterious circumstances. Henry in Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, he walks out derelict in rain after Catherine dies in a childbirth. Same sensibility, same sense as you have in the modern British and European novel. So they were again piggybacking the European novelists, European artists. But after the Second World War, something drastic happened in America. And American mind opened. Americans realized their identity. The reasons were their significant role in the victory of the non-Nazi forces, that is Allied forces, in the Second World War. America played a crucial role. America proved to be a game changer in the Second World War. Otherwise, I think consequences would have been disastrous. So the whole country was, was full of enthusiasm, full of confidence. But then there was some kind of, psychic exhaustion among Americans, psychic exhaustion, among those who fought on the fronts and also among those who stayed back in the homes. Now, 50s after the war, the first decade after the war, Second World War, 1950s, was rather a silent decade, a tranquil decade, a quiet decade. Eisenhower was the president. He was a man of old world values. There was not much of a chance for innovation and experimentation in cultural field or moral field or intellectual field in any other thing. He was a traditionalist. So nothing happened in the 50s. Nothing much happened in the 50s. But whatever happened, whatever little happened in a different way or differently, proved to be revolutionary later on. Now, apparently 50s was a decade of peace and silence. But there was something simmering beneath the surface, something boiling beneath the surface, a kind of revolution. And it needed a prick. The bubble was growing, it needed only a prick. Two things proved to be potential reasons for the coming cultural, moral revolution in America in the 60s. And what were those two things? In the 50s, 3 novels were published from 3 different ethnic groups. One was Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. The second was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And third was Saul Bellow's Henderson the Rainy King. And in all these 3 novels, the protagonists talk the same language. These 3 novelists, they were writing separately, without meeting each other, maybe even without knowing each other. But they were writing something which was going to acquire the central stage in the next decade. Old Man and the Sea. Santiago, the old man, he says, I will show what a man is and what a man can do. A man can be broken but not defeated. And then Henderson, what Henderson says, I will read it out to you because the quotation is remarkable and you would like it in this context, in Hemingway's context. And what he says, what Henderson says, life may think it has got me written off in its records. Henderson types so-and-so with the auk and the platypus, illustrating such and such a principle and laid aside. But life may find itself surprised, for after all, we are men. Isn't it Santiago echoing here? Don't you hear the echo of Santiago here? What a man is and what a man can do. He says, for after all, we are men. I am man. I myself, singular as it may look, man. And man has many times tricked life when life thought it had him taped. So I can go to the last words of the Invisible Man also. And Invisible Man also talks with the same enthusiasm, with the same, courage to rise again and to rise again and again. No frustration, no disillusionment, no exhaustion, no getting back, no defeat, only victory, nothing else. They did not compromise. So these 3 novels they changed the fictional trend in America. And in the beginning of the 60s, the second thing that happened was the President John F. Kennedy becoming the President of America. And Kennedy, he was youthful, he was handsome. He came from a very illustrious family of America, Kennedy's richest clan in America. And he was Cambridge graduate, Harvard graduate, and so on and so forth. He generated a wave of euphoria and optimism. And there was experimentation all around in all the fields, cultural, intellectual, academic, and domestic, and so on and so forth. And then some movements, this euphoria and optimism, it triggered some 3 prominent movements. One was women's liberation movement. The other was civil rights movement. The third was hippie movement. And along with this, the euphoria and optimism led to Vietnam War. An information came to American Pentagon that an American ship was attacked in the Tonkin Gulf near Vietnam. And Vietnam, out of euphoria and optimism, America, out of euphoria and optimism, attacked Vietnam. And what happened? America had to retract finally after 7 years. And they discovered later on that the news was false. It was a false news. But by then, America had gone deeper into the war, and it had become a prestige issue for a nation which was aspiring to become the world power. So all these things, they combine to sort of, create a climate of fermentation, intellectual, cultural, academic, and social fermentation in America. And American mind opened up. And then what came? Multiculturalism, multiracialism, and multiplicity on all levels. And in this climate of liberalism, it was a decade of liberalism. In this climate of liberalism, the Jews opened their mouths. They opened their minds. They became active. They found the soil very fertile, and they began to give expression to their intellectual aspirations. And in the process, a huge corpus of Jewish novel came into existence. Number of Jewish novelists, they sprung on the American scene with some of their best novels, some of the classics, which the posterity will never let willingly die. And who were they? They were like, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Philip Roth, and Cynthia Ozick, and so many of them. Even poets, Delmer Schwartz and John Berryman, and many others. They occupied the American literary scene, and they dominated it. Not only they dominated it, they ruled over it. They became unchallenged monarchs of American literary landscape after the war, in the 60s and 70s. So that was the period of counterculture. That was the period of discardance of the old. Whatever was old was useless. Whatever was new was acceptable. So there was a craze for novelty, and this craze for novelty, in this craze for reinvention of the old values and creation of the new values, Jewish novel prospered. And today, if you think of American literature, you think first of all of Jewish American novel, right? So now I will take up some of the common characteristics of the Jewish novels. All the novelists wrote separately, wrote in their own ways, gave expression to their own experiences, to their own intellectual manifestations and so on. But there were certain things which were common to all the entire corpus of the Jewish novel. And I would enumerate upon them one by one, maybe not many, because I have been given by Dr. Kondar Nageswara Rao 1 hour, and out of in that 1 hour I would keep 5 to 10 minutes for question and answer also. So just explain that. First of all, the dominant characteristic of the Jewish novel is Holocaust. You won't find any Jewish novel in America without a mention or without a truncated treatment or a full-scale treatment of the Holocaust. Holocaust, as you know, in the Second World War, 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis, and in Nazi Germany and in some other parts of Europe. 6 million, innocent Jews were butchered in a very careless manner, and it's all history now, and everybody knows in the world. So Holocaust was, it was on the Jewish mind. Not only on the Jewish mind, but all the fair minds of the world during that period. Some people suffered it directly, some people suffered it indirectly, vicariously. Sufferings are of two types. One is direct, the other is indirect. When you go to a cinema and you see the protagonist suffering, beaten by the villain, you suffer. Some people turn and twist in their chairs when the protagonist is being beaten by the villain. That is indirect and vicarious suffering. And all the Jews who had not participated who had not suffered in the Holocaust, they suffered vicariously, indirectly. Not only that they suffered vicariously and indirectly, they also developed a survival guilt. Now, in Jewish fiction, there are two types of survival guilt. One is survival guilt among those who survived the camps. They harbored a guilt. And what was the guilt? The guilt was that they lived because others died. They lived, they survived the camp because at the expense of others. Now, those who did not suffer in the Holocaust directly, they suffered vicariously. They also, harbored survival guilt, that they could not do anything for their brothers. They could not do anything for their sisters. They could not do anything for their Jewish community who were, killed so mercilessly. But then many of them came out to expiate this survival guilt. The actual survivors, like Elie Wiesel, and vicarious, sufferers like Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, Ozick, and many others. So, how did they overcome this survival guilt in their novels? They overcome the survival guilt in their novels by talking about Holocaust and by valorizing the martyrdom of their Jewish brothers in the labor camps, concentration camps. They did that by valorizing the sacrifices or martyrdom of those people who never came back, who suffered and died there only. Okay? So Holocaust became a consistent and constant trope in Jewish novel. Now, the second most important, characteristic of the Jewish novel is struggle for survival. The Jews, many Jews in the Holocaust, in the concentration camps, they struggled for their survival. They adopted, different strategies. They, invented various means and measures to overcome the grief, to overcome the pain, to sort of, mitigate their agony. Different ways and means, they indigenous ways and means in the camps, which could mitigate their pain, their suffering, and could help some of them to survive. Right? So survival became some kind of, some kind of an inalienable part of every Jewish mind, every Jewish thought. And now you take up any novel, you will find, whether it's a Holocaust or not, there will certainly be some struggle for survival on the part of the protagonist. So the protagonist in Jewish novel is an activist protagonist. He does not sit quiet and allow things happen to him. No, he devises artifices, he devises various strategies, and he counterfoils all those afflictions which challenge their sanity, which challenge their morality, and which encroach upon their dignity. So survival is a staple, characteristic of all the Jewish novels, of the American Jewish novels in the post-war period. Right? Now the other is affirmation. Affirmation means affirmation of life. In the modernist novel, as I told you, the protagonists were not able to face life, not able to face the onslaughts of life squarely. Many of those protagonists of the great novelists like Lawrence and Joyce and Woolf and others, they succumbed to their circumstances. They accepted their victimhood as absolute. But here the Jewish novelists, they set a new trend of activism, new trend of resourcefulness, new trend of indigeneity. They, work out their own means and methods to thwart the encroachments upon their life, their sanity, and their integrity. You pick up any of the Jewish novels, and the protagonist would be found talking about some morality or the other, living on the basis of some moral principles. Particularly, Malamud's protagonists, they are so, aware of their identity, their integrity, their morality, that they don't allow it to be encroached. Take this, The Fixer, a beautiful novel, one of the classics of the 20th century. There, a simple handyman, he fights the entire, monolithic bureaucratic system in Russia, and ultimately he wins a symbolic victory. There are many others who fight the establishment, who fight the despots, and who fight the situations which are overwhelming for them, and they survive it on the basis of their own intellectual ingenuity. Right? So other, very, conspicuous aspect of the American Jewish novel is assimilation. Assimilation, which means to assimilate into the mainstream American life. The Jewish intellectuals in the 40s and 50s, particularly, an intellectual group in the, what I should say, late 40s. They gave a call to the Jews, assimilate with the mainstream American life. Don't look distinct. Don't look different from others. Look like them, behave like them, talk like them, eat the kind of food they eat. Be one with them. Join the mainstream. Assimilate yourself with the mainstream life. Otherwise, there might happen a Holocaust once again. Openly they said. And many of the American novelists, Jewish American novelists, they came forward to highlight this slogan, assimilate. And foremost among them was Malamud, Bernard Malamud. And he said, now everyone is a Jew. Everybody is an outcast. Everybody has frustrated aspirations. Everybody feels persecuted. The Jew has come closer to the common person now than he was ever before, or more close to a common person than he ever was before. So there is very, very little, very thin difference between a common man and a Jew. So every man is a Jew is every man. There's a story by Malamud, I think it's a Jew bird or some other, I'm forgetting the title, I'm becoming forgetful because of, the advancing age and my increasing academic interests. In that story, says, Fanny, see, I see Jews everywhere. Everyone around is a Jew. Everyone has all those problems that Jews are facing right now, persecution, alienation, isolation, and so on. So there is no difference between a Jew and a common man. Now, the boundaries, the borders are overlapping, and they are likely to exchange their places very soon because life is becoming increasingly complicated. So you have this kind of, call for assimilation. Next is suffering. Suffering is another constant trope in American fiction. Suffering is ennobling. It's a means for ennoblement. I think in Malamud's, the assistant, the Bober says, if a Jew, he's not the protagonist, but he's an old Jew, a grocer. He says, if a Jew has not suffered for the law, he has not suffered. He has suffered for nothing. Meaning that the Jews suffer as a matter of their inner prompting. And they suffer and they burn their deformities, intellectual, moral, in the heat of their suffering. So suffering everywhere in American novel is ennobling. It is like, fire refines the gold into platinum. There, a fire of, suffering refines every human being into a noble human being. So you when you read, you keep, track of all these things. Now, the next is humor. Humor is another very important aspect of Jewish novel. You cannot miss the Jewish humor. There are, Americans are very fond of, labeling humor. Black humor, Jewish humor, this humor, that humor, and so on and so forth. So there is something like, wry humor, Jewish humor, typically Jewish humor. It is intellectual humor. And you find it everywhere in all the Jewish novels. I give one instance from, I think it is from Malamud's new life. There is a young boy and young girl. They go out somewhere in some, farmhouse. They get indulged romantically, and they get into the act. And when they are into the act, a cow comes and takes away their clothes. They wrap, twigs and branches around them, and then they enter the city. It's such a humorous scene. One reads it again and again, the way Malamud has depicted it. So you find many such, humorous instances. If you read Bellow's Henderson the Rain King, it's a great comic novel. And after the publication of this novel, Bellow was hailed as the comedy king. In Herzog also. So many, humorous instances, many comic instances, which, really, turn you on and you read them time and again. So humor is another very important aspect. There is, I think, one more very crucial aspect of this novel, that is Shlemiel. Shlemiel is a Yiddish word. Shlemiel. Shlemiel means a fall guy. Get it? Like Herzog is a fall guy. Big and intellectual, great intellectual, whose the fate of civilization depends upon his ideas. A professor of political philosophy ultimately turns out to be a fall guy. Similarly, there are fall guys elsewhere in American novel. I give you another instance. There is a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer, Gimple the Fool. Gimple the Fool. Gimple is a very simple boy. He works in a bakery, and he has a very beautiful wife, and he's devoted to her, and so on and so forth. But then what happens when Gimple is away to the bakery? His wife, she entertains other men. She entertains other males, and he doesn't know about it. He gets children, and Gimple thinks they are his children. Naturally, because he didn't know that his wife was entertaining other people in his absence. But what happened that his wife, I think she fell sick, she suffered from cancer or something, and she was on the deathbed. And she calls Gimple out of sheer guilt and tells him that those children were not his. Those children were of some other people, and she couldn't name them. Gimple says, no, you are telling a lie. Don't tell a lie at the last moment of your life. You cannot be disloyal to me. These children are my children only. And see there, it's a very emotional scene. Gimple refuses to accept that his wife was disloyal and his children were not his children. The lady dies. He expiates his guilt by not admitting, and she dies guilty by admitting it. So Gimple is a real model of a fall guy. And more than any other American novelist, Isaac Bashevis's fiction is full of such innocent, pure-hearted fall guys, Shlemiels. So, ladies and gentlemen, these were some of the broad characteristics of this Jewish novel, and I think I have almost exhausted my time. And I saw some questions popping up.
Mr. Anjaneyulu asking, sir, I want to know the clarification from the history of English literature and linguistic changes in the form of writings, innovations, etc. Jews were so intellectuals than Indians. According to you, what's your opinion, sir? This is a question by one of the participants here.
Yeah, you're right. You know, the American language was, American English was greatly replenished by the Jewish scholars, Jewish writers, and Jewish poets. If you read, a person like John Updike, a Wasp novelist, and you read a novelist like, Saul Bellow, or you read Singer, or you read Elie Wiesel, you find a very different kind of English. Very, mellifluous English. Very, fascinating English. It's not the traditional Wasp English. They did experiments in language. They replenished English language. They strengthened it. And I'm sure many Wasp novelists and writers, they went after Jewish novelists and Jewish poets. So they did a great service to English language also. For instance, you read Saul Bellow's Herzog. It's a masterpiece in English language. And similarly, there are other novelists also who did, like, Catch-22, Heller's Catch-22. Beautiful language, the language of common man, common person, raised to the artistic heights. Common language of everyday conversation, raised to the artistic heights. So that is what the Jewish novelists did to English language. They made a great contribution. They strengthened it. They replenished it, and they sort of made it more congenial for artistic creativity. Yes.
Sir, may I read second question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It is from YouTube Live, sir. Professor, I think Damodar sir is asking this question. Sir, what prompted you to move to philosophy of yoga? How can it be integrated into comparative literature? Which is your forte?
Yeah, you are right. It's something very surprising. But then, when I was working for my doctoral dissertation at the University of Hyderabad, I think you may not know that I was the first PhD in English and first admission also. So I was, I would see that these American novelists that I worked on, 4 novelists I worked on, it was a massive thesis, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, John Updike, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., 4 of them, very prominent and very popular novelists, I really worked on. It was a massive thesis. So when I was doing it, I found that there were some, some Indic influences on them. Time and again, it would occur to me, I should work on this theme, I should work on this theme. Then I applied to UGC for a what is that fellowship, major research project, and I got it. Under that project, I worked on philosophy of yoga in contemporary American novel. And while doing that, I read a lot of yoga, a lot of tantra. I read a number of books, about 100 books I read on different aspects of yoga. And I wrote four articles which were published in some of the very prestigious world-class journals in America and Europe. And now I'm bringing out that book. That book will come out from Oxford, Peter Lang, maybe the end of this month. Philosophy of Yoga in contemporary American novel. On those 4 novelists. The book will come out end of this year. But then Professor Sunana Singh, she was my colleague and she knew my work. She asked me to come and teach yoga philosophy and history at Nalanda. I had already worked a lot. I had already, read a lot. It was very easy for me to start it out, and I've been going strong here, and I'm enjoying also my work. And after that, I have read much more than what I had read earlier. So that is how the whole story began, and that is how I got into. I got onto a road not taken.
Sir, the next question, sir, by Rabi Samantai. Sir, how important is the concept of Jerusalem and the issues of Middle East in modern Jewish American psyche?
See, Jewish American psyche in America, Jewish American psyche is always, empathetic and sympathetic towards Jerusalem and all that is going on there now. And I think it's a matter of racial affiliation. And what they say, persecution, a kind of persecution complex, which has diminished quite a bit, but it still remains the persecution complex. And they whenever there is some problem in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv or anywhere in Israel, American Jews immediately respond as an empathetic or sympathetic matter. And they respond out of this persecution complex that Jews are still in danger. Jews are still, insecure in this world. So they do respond emotionally, sentimentally. That is my. This is more of a political. Yes, Dr. Nageswara, any other question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Dr. Christopher from Arts College wants to. Christopher sir wants to ask you something.
Oh, sure.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sukhbir Singh.
Very nice to hear you.
Nice to hear you after a very long time, sir. Not a question actually. I was just responding to the question that somebody else asked.
Audio is not good. Yeah.
Okay. Am I audible now, sir? Can you hear me?
You are audible, but the voice is not clear.
Okay. Right. No, I was just referring to the question that another participant asked just a while ago. The American Jewish responses to Jerusalem. I just would like to add that, there is no one Jewish response because you have different, all kinds of political perspectives among Jews in America. You have people like Chomsky or, so it would be a generalization to say that all Jews respond, similarly to everything that happens.
See, I think the basic instinctive response is the same, whether it is this Jew or that Jew or whatever it is. But the basic instinctive response, the essential response is the same. And it is a racial response out of persecution complex that Jews are still in danger, that Jews are still, insecure, and there may again be a problem for the Jews. It will take hundreds of years. It was so horrifying for the Jewish community. You read that book by Eichmann in Jerusalem. Read that book. You will see how the Jews were killed like insects, like reptiles. And this has gone into their blood and their bones. This would not come out so very easily. So whoever are those Jews, wherever they are, they do respond silently or eloquently. And essential response is the same. It doesn't vary in quality, but it may vary in kind. Yes, Dr.
Sir. Yeah, sir, shall I move to the next question? Sir, it is a question on YouTube live from my own PhD scholar from Azim Ali. He is asking, sir, Jewish masculinity has undergone tremendous change from being viewed historically as effeminate to hyper-masculine Zionist agenda. Can you comment on it?
I didn't get it properly. Dr. Nageshwar Rao. Can you repeat it once again?
Yes, sir. Jewish masculinity has undergone tremendous change from being viewed historically.
Yeah, see, there is certainly a change after the Second World War and after their migration to America. And they have, come up intellectually, they have come up financially, and I think they are a prominent community in America now. Jews can do without America, but America cannot do without Jews. That is their social and political situation now. You get it. They hold the strings of the purse. If they want, they can demolish American economy within no time. They are so powerful, they are so strong. And intellectually, Jewish literature reigns supreme in America. I don't think any non-Jewish novelist, maybe some of the African Americans, can come anywhere closer in depth, in variety of subject, and in the illustration of the scenes, situations, and language, etc. In many respects, they are unique and they are distinct.
Yes. Yes, sir. Now, ma'am, you want to ask a question?
So you're saying, where will you place Faulkner?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I should have included it in my lecture. I would place Faulkner with the British modernists.
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
He aligns more with the British modernists rather than with the post-war American Jewish or other novelists. So that is how.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Because technique and themes and that stream of consciousness technique and other things, they are all, they come from James Joyce and they come from Virginia Woolf, and I think he's more with them than with the many of the American novelists. Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, because we were brought up reading Hemingway and Faulkner. And thank you very much for bringing the Jewish novelist, because we tend to think more of African-American novelists like Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and so on.
Gloria Naylor and all those people, yeah. True, yeah.
Thank you very much for bringing the Jewish novelist. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, the last question from YouTube Live. Mr. Chandrasekhar is asking, sir, any space for views in the form of writing in Jewish literature on capitalism?
I think indirectly they don't they castigate capitalism indirectly, not directly, but in certain in certain some of their portrayals. They do, castigate the money lenders, they castigate the rich people, and so on and so forth. There is a satirical attitude towards them, and more so in those eminent American novelists like Miller and Bellow and Roth. They always have a kind of, ridiculing attitude towards them. So they themselves they have been money lenders themselves. They are very rich. Jewish community is very rich, but the intellectuals, they are not so much for wealth and for richness. They castigate the rich people. They call them unscrupulous, they call them immoral, exploiters, and so on and so forth. So they don't encourage capitalism.
Sir, thank you, sir. We are getting series of questions after our talk. One of the participants, Noel Anthony, is asking a question, sir. Is specific Jewish literature in France? The study of Jewish authors and their writing is not sufficient grounds to indicate that such a group exists as a socio-historical entity, that their existence is real and not merely nominal.
Yeah, you know, there is a Jewish novel in present. At present, there is a Jewish novel in Germany also. There is a Jewish novel in France, and but that the corpus is so thin, and resistance to recognition is so much that they are not able to come to limelight. But in America, the Jewish novelists came to limelight and they dominated the world scene simply because the situation was very congenial. The situation was very favorable. But now in Europe, racism raising its head again in Europe, I think the Jewish writers are still, the Jewish writers are again at a disadvantage. There seems to be some resistance to their acknowledgement, to their identification. But there is a Jewish novel in Britain, there is a Jewish novel in France, and also in Germany. Jews are, you see, you cannot stop Jews from writing. Even in the concentration camps, they wrote. Have you read you might have heard of this Diaries of Anne Frank, classic. Similarly, many other Jews, they wrote in very, untoward circumstances, in very cruel circumstances. That is how they overcame their grief and their pain by giving it a vent through their creative writing.
Can I speak something, sir? With your permission?
Please. Yes, please. Yes, please. Can you switch on your video and audio? Yes.
Yeah, I have switched on, sir. Thank you so much. Good evening, sir. Good evening, Sukhbir, sir. It was really very nice to see and hear you. And for a time being, you have really transported us from pandemic to Holocaust. Thank you so much for the informative session. And I really thank the organizers for giving us this privilege to hear such a great stalwart of Osmania University. And I'm really happy that I have completed my PhD with you, sir. Just wanted to ask one thing, sir, since the net had got disrupted and I couldn't hear you completely. I had asked you one question, if we can bring the feeling of guilt in Old Man and the Sea. Because when during that novel, we are teaching it right now in our graduation. So at one point of time, the old man, he is feeling guilty of killing the Merlin. So when you have talked about the characteristics of the Jewish novels, I was thinking, can we emphasize on that? Because he also felt, at a point of time, he really felt guilty that I should not have killed the fish. Can you, if you can give me a little explanation, sir?
Yeah, it's a good question in the sense that he does feel bad about killing the Marlin for his own survival. I think it's human nature. We are human beings and we do certain things out of necessity and out of compulsion also. But we do feel bad about it. But this is not guilt. This is just a momentary feeling of feeling of what I should say, grief over our own action. Oh, I have done it, but I couldn't help it, and so on and so on. It's just a passing feeling. Guilt is a more deep, it's a kind of deeper feeling, and it besieges you in some very special circumstances, and it remains with you for long. It's not that you feel guilty and you forget the same moment. No, it's a deeper feeling, and there, I think Santiago, he does feel bad, but not really guilty. Like, you know, Rama killed Ravana, but then he was not happy. He was not happy to kill the demon. That kind of a feeling. But it was his profession. It was his profession. He couldn't have lived without killing the fish. He was a fisherman. So no guilt and no sin. We can say, was he a sinner? No sin. Not at all. When you walk the earth, you kill so many insects, which you would not do consciously. But then you do kill. That's not sin, because you cannot stop walking. So many ships drown in the ocean. That is in the nature of the ocean. The lion eats so many animals, even men. But that's in the nature of lion, how he would live. So in these professional matters, these matters of necessity and requirement, the guilt and these things, they don't arise.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, any other question?
Thank you, sir. At the outset, my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Sukhbir Singh, sir, for sparing valuable time with the OUCIP and delivering a wonderful talk on post-war Jewish American novel. Sir's talk has covered many areas, and from concentration camps, Holocaust, how Nazism, and on the other side, fascism, how they were responsible for anarchy, and how the merciless killings, concentration camps and all. Once again, you have taken us to a movie, and your lecture is like a movie, like a serial, and we could imagine the things through your lecture, sir. And most of the scholars and teachers are benefited by your wonderful talk, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Sir. Thank you very much.